In fact, it can even be argued that peace operations now constitute the first line of defense against violent extremism. Secondly, the diversity in peace operations is indicative of the type of partnership needed to address the multi-pronged cause and effect of violent extremism. The singular act of deploying a peace operation is not a panacea to combating violent extremism, as it is imperative to build concentric partnerships at all levels that will leverage on the presence of these operations and improve their efficiency. In prevention terms, the relationships between peace operations and communities in their areas of operation is vital. In addition, partnerships at the political level to provide the requisite level of political, financial, and material assistance to the peace operations must be enhanced to ensure effectiveness and predictability in their operations. This is more relevant as peace operations involved in counterterrorism operations continue to face severe resource constraints. Thirdly, being on the front line, peace operations play a critical role in furthering the peace and development nexus that is required to sustainably and holistically address this scourge. A military approach does not guarantee long-term solutions. It must be accompanied by long-term programmatic responses that will address the structural causes of violent extremism. Therefore, the deployment of peace operations to prevent and counter violent extremism must be accompanied by strategic and operational plans and programs to provide basic services, address unemployment, youth unemployment in particular, exclusion, discrimination, and poverty that are some of the main drivers of radicalization and recruitment into these groups. In the Sahel, for example, the Priority Investment Program is being implemented simultaneously with the operations of the G5 Sahel Force, while in the Lake Chad Basin region, and I want to acknowledge my brother, Ambassador Nu, who is here, Secretary General of the LCBC. The Lake Chad region has also launched the Regional Strategy for the Stabilization, Recovery, and Resilience of the Boko Haram affected areas, and this is being implemented alongside the operations of the MNJTF. Fourthly, the success of peace operations to prevent and counter violent extremism will largely depend on the level of confidence and trust between them and the local population. An important aspect in this regard is a respect for human rights norms and standards during their operations, which is critical in winning the hearts and minds. Peace operations that are perceived to be targeting the population and failing to respect human rights will face severe challenges in the implementation of their mandates. Cognizant of this, peace operations are increasingly taking steps to put in place safeguards to prevent and address any violations implicating any of their members. Fifthly, strengthening coordination, promoting local ownership and leadership must remain at the core of the regional and international response on preventing and countering violent extremism. Local ownership, which guarantees the meaningful participation of all members of the population, including women and youth, should be strongly encouraged, as these groups play important roles in the overall response to violent extremism and as such are key partners for peace operations. Furthermore, the fact that violent extremists keep blurring territorial boundaries thereby increasing their footprint across borders, calls for enhanced cross-border coordination between peace operations and states on military, humanitarian, justice, and development issues. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the nature of the threat posed by violent extremism compels us to collectively renew and redouble our efforts while remaining engaged and determined that it can and will be defeated. Success can only be achieved if we defeat both the terrorists and terrorism. This will require continued collective action in line with the true African tradition of helping to put out the fire in the neighbor's house before it reaches yours. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank Commandant Griffith Evans and the KPTC for organizing this forum in memory of my husband and for inviting me to join you here in Accra as representing the Kofi Annan Foundation. As a son of Ghana and Africa, the peace and security of the continent was a personal as well as professional concern for my husband. Our distinguished speakers have already highlighted that the spread of violent extremism is destabilizing and terrorizing society and communities across Africa. Violent extremism is causing massive population displacement, economic disruption, and humanitarian crisis. We must recognize, however, that the drivers are multiple, complex, and context-specific. With so many experts in the room, I will not pretend to know the answers to this existential threat. But however, allow me to flag 3 points in particular. First, evidence suggests that violent extremism cannot be solved through security responses and military solutions alone. It demands a holistic approach. According to the UN Development Programme's research on the sources of violent extremism here in Africa, socio-economic and political marginalization, a lack of education, state violence, and poverty are all contributing factors. This underscores the importance of closely aligning security and development strategies. Building democratic institutions and processes that ensures human rights and the rule of law and promote accountability are critical ingredients in countering extremism and should be an integral part of our peace efforts. Through its Elections and Democracy program, the Kofi Annan Foundation works in a number of countries to strengthen the integrity of electoral processes in order to build, strengthen, and safeguard democracy, which also serves as a bulwark against extremism. In fact, today, the Foundation is hosting a conference in Cape Town that specifically looks at challenges to democracy in Central and Southern Africa. Second, I want to underline the important role of civil society organizations. They often have a unique access to their communities and can turn vulnerable individuals away from violent ideologies and radical groups. Third, I believe that we must fully engage young people, especially young women, in all our efforts, including policy making, to prevent radicalization. And I'm glad that the role of women and youth will be highlighted here. Africa is today the youngest continent in the world. About 60% of its entire population is under the age of 25. And all too often, young people are both the victims and perpetrators of violence driven by extremist beliefs. The crucial preventive role that youth can play tends to be overlooked, although they are well placed to spot early signs of radicalization and create safe dialogue spaces for their peers to express their frustrations. The Kofi Annan Foundation, through its youth-led initiative called Extremely Together, works with a group of young leaders in Africa and from around the world to prevent and counter violent extremism. As positive role models, these courageous young people inspire others to promote dialogue and tolerance among the peers. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, your leadership, action and vision can play an important role in addressing violent extremism and building a peaceful Africa. As my late husband often said, there's much more in this world that unites us than there is that divides us.
This forum, its maiden edition, is being held in commemoration of one of the truly iconic figures of modern times, the highly respected former Secretary General of the United Nations, the late Kofi Annan, that noble Ghanaian who brought such renown to our country, Ghana. A man who was an ardent believer in the capacity of the Ghanaian and African to chart his or her own course onto the path of progress and prosperity. I'm delighted that his widow, Madame Nan Maria Annan, could join us at this forum as we continue to pay tribute to the memory of this illustrious Ghanaian and African. May his soul continue to rest in perfect peace in the bosom of the Almighty until the last day of the resurrection, when we shall all meet again. Amen. The theme for this forum, peace operations in the context of violent extremism in Africa, highlights the major priority of the contemporary agenda on our continent, which we must collectively confront, and which gives us cause to continue to celebrate the works of Kofi Annan, a man who spent his life making peace where there was conflict. The theme also prompts a number of immediate questions. First, what should be the role of peace support missions in the context of violent extremism? Secondly, what kind of peace support operations can provide effective response to the phenomenon of violent extremism? Thirdly, how should such missions be composed and deployed? Fourthly, which entity or entities are best placed to mandate and capacitate them? And fifthly, how should human rights be observed in the midst of violent extremism? The answers to these questions should influence your deliberations over the next 2 days, and I'm expectant that the communiqué will provide us with some much-needed guidelines. Ladies and gentlemen, over the years, we have learned, most often through bitter experience, that terrorism and violent extremism are not restricted to particular geographic locations or jurisdictions, as the impact of a single terrorist incident in one part of the world resonates throughout the world. West Africa in recent years has become a hotbed of terrorist and extremist activities as a result of greater activism of groups operating in the northeast of Nigeria, the Lake Chad Basin, Mali, and the Greater Sahel. Endemic poverty and widespread disillusionment amongst youth in Africa are not only providing fertile breeding grounds for those who want to cross the Sahara Desert on foot and the Mediterranean Sea in rickety boats in the hope of finding a better future in Europe, but also for a new generation of terrorists and violent extremists. This is most worrying because surrogates of Al-Qaeda in the Sahel and Boko Haram militants operating around the Lake Chad Basin, the two most active terrorist groups in West Africa, are known to exploit the unacceptable levels of poverty in these areas in the recruitment and indoctrination of youth. Furthermore, the growing number of breakaway terror groups, in addition to our natural vulnerabilities, notably the spread of ethno-linguist groups and the porous nature of our borders, call for regional and continental approaches to contain the growing threats of terrorist and extremist activities. Despite it being a beacon of peace, stability, and democracy in a region that is plagued by the activities of terrorist and extremist groups, Ghana must know she cannot be immune from terror attacks. She's determined, however, to deepen the religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence that exist between the majority Christian and the minority Muslim religious groupings in the country. They are hallmarks of our nation, which we cherish. Our major encounter so far with the terrorist or extremist group came in 2015, when agents of the so-called Islamic State succeeded in recruiting a few adherents from the country's university campuses to join the ranks of the group's fighters in Libya and Syria. They are known to have died in combat. 2 Germans of Ghanaian parentage are also known to have joined the group, with one currently serving a jail term in Hamburg in Germany. The activities of terrorists and extremist groups in Ghana, for now, take the form mainly of fundraising activities by allegedly charitable organizations, which divert these funds to support extremist activities around the world. Last year, security agencies in Ghana had to disrupt the activities of groups purporting to raise funds for Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, which were in fact funds for fundraising for terror-related activities. In aid of the global call to action against terrorism and violent extremism, Ghana has signed and ratified a number of international instruments aimed at the prevention and suppression of international terrorism. The contents of these instruments have also served as guides in the formulation of our counterterrorism policy, which seeks to prevent acts of terrorism in the country. The counterterrorism policy has led to the setting up of a counterterrorism unit within the National Security Council Secretariat to lead and coordinate our efforts in the fight. Ghana has adopted a well-coordinated interagency approach, which encourages the timely sharing of information and intelligence, operational coordination, and joint strategy formulation, and has proved essential towards ensuring the efficient execution of the country's counterterrorism policy. I recall my meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2017 in New York, where we discussed the need for increased collaboration within West African countries in tackling the increasing incidence of terrorism and violent extremism in the region, a proposition that Ghana heartily endorses. Ghana continues to establish closer ties and good working relations with security organizations in West Africa in a bid to improve the collaborative framework within the region. She's a regular participant in the meetings of the Committee of Intelligence and Security Services of Africa, CISA, and AU body. The quintet meetings, known as the Accra Initiative, involving security and intelligence heads from Ghana and her neighboring countries, namely Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Togo, and Benin, are also held frequently to review and formulate joint strategies towards combating shared threats on terrorism and violent extremism. The shared nature of threats confronting West African countries and emanating from terrorist and extremist groups in the region demands the enhanced collaboration of all security actors within the region. That is why I, like many in West Africa, was happy that the leaders of Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso, known as the G5 du Sahel, have launched a multinational force to fight armed groups in the Sahel region, with 1 battalion each from the 5 countries. The coordination of activities between the armed forces and the intelligence agencies of our respective countries is absolutely essential to a successful battle against terrorism. Furthermore, we believe that others should emulate the example of France, Germany, and other members of the European Union in providing assistance to and thereby enhancing the capacity of the G5 du Sahel. Already, these poor countries are having to spend unacceptably high proportions of their national budgets on defense and security matters, to the obvious detriment of necessary expenditures on social concerns. Therefore, their call for global solidarity must not go unheeded. The UN Security Council, responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, must step up to the plate. The fight against terrorism and violent extremism cannot be limited only to military means, vital as they are. Broader policies must also be put in place to create opportunities and jobs for our youth if we are to deal successfully with their root causes. Firstly, through education. We have as a matter of great urgency to ensure access to education for all our youth. We're told that 89 million young Africans of school-going age are not in school. That has to stop, and stop now. In Ghana, at great cost, we have, since my assumption of office in January 2017, instituted a system of free secondary education, which has increased enrollment by nearly 50%. From this month, when schools reopen, 1.2 million Ghanaian children will be beneficiaries of the free senior high school policy, the highest number of pupils in secondary school in our history. The cost of providing free secondary school education will be cheaper than the cost of the alternative of an uneducated and unskilled youthful workforce that has the capacity to retard our development and to pose a threat to the peace and stability of our nation. Secondly, through the structural transformation of our economies. With the majority of the continent's economies dependent on the production and export of raw materials, it is not surprising that our youth want to leave in search of greener pastures elsewhere in economies that generate more jobs. We cannot continue traveling this worn path of limited success of being exporters of raw materials. We have to embark urgently on the structural transformation of our economies. The only way to ensuring prosperity for our populations in Africa is through value addition activities. In other words, through industrial development with modernized agricultures in transformed and diversified economies. We must rapidly leave behind the old agrarian economies and embrace the technological and digital potential of the new modern economies, and thereby give opportunities, jobs, and hope to our young people to live dignified, productive lives here at home. Thirdly, through good governance. It is important that we promote and develop on the continent a system and culture of accountable governance, free of corruption, whereby our people are governed in accordance with the rule of law, respect for individual liberties and human rights, and the principles of democratic accountability. Such a system requires building strong institutions of state, such as well-resourced parliaments and judiciaries, efficient law enforcement agencies, and effective security forces that see their responsibilities and allegiance to the wider public interest, not just to the conveniences of the government of the day. Innovative, creative mobilization, and disciplined use of public resources are therefore of the utmost importance in the struggle for national development. It can be done. So I say in conclusion, the terrorism and violent extremism constitute major threats to the very survival of our nations, and it is my fervent wish that we leave this year's forum with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear strategy which will help us win the fight against terrorism and violent extremism in Africa, and by so doing, guarantee continental peace and security, essential to the socio-economic development of Africa. May God bless Mother Africa and us all. I thank you for your attention.